So now I'm going to ask you the question that has outlived its usefulness. And I love your answer for this, and you can explain it. Where were you when JFK was shot?
I'll answer the question because in the last several days, several people have asked me that.
Yeah.
It always comes up among people who are alive and old enough to remember where they were at the time that President Kennedy was killed. And most people can remember. And I can remember. I was in what was called the junior high school in those days. Today it's Brattleboro Area Middle School. But in junior high school, and a voice came on the public address system and said that the President of the United States had been killed and everybody was going to be excused from school. So we were sent home. And then the news flash came at 38 minutes past the hour. Walter Cronkite said, "It's official now, President Kennedy is dead." So it was 2:28 in the afternoon here in Vermont when the announcement was made. And then shortly after that, the public address system came on and said we were all to be sent home. And I came to this building right here, and I went in that room where the television was, and except for sleeping and eating, I was in front of that television like millions of other Americans.
After the assassination happens, there's this imagery, there's John behind the casket, there's all this stuff, there's this national mourning. What was the whole vibe like after that happened?
Well, there was a funeral.
The funeral, yeah.
At the beginning of the following week.
Yeah.
President Kennedy's body was sent back to Washington, D.C.
And filter all of that through the lens of Brattleboro, if you can.
Watching it on television every minute. And a consequence of that was that your mother and her brother, 13 years old, watched on live television Lee Harvey Oswald being paraded and out of the jail cell, down the hallway, down the elevator, out another hallway, and out into the basement, the parking garage of the Dallas City Jail, and the guy walks out of the crowd and shoots him. I watched that on live TV.
With Teddy.
With Teddy. I don't know who else was in the room. To be honest with you, I wouldn't surprise me if the whole family had been in the room at that time. But I was glued to that television set.
Did you talk to the people in the neighborhood?
No, not a word to people in the neighborhood.
Really? About JFK stuff?
No, we stayed in the house. Everybody was hunkered down, and there was maybe this is strong, but a morbid curiosity as to why this had all happened. And you remember, this is the perspective of a 13-year-old kid.
Yeah.
This community, the county, the state, the region, New England, the United States, and parts of the world were consumed by this. The murder of President Kennedy took place on Friday, November 22nd, but on November 24, at a little bit before 11:30 in the afternoon, the arrested assailant was shot to death inside the Dallas City Jail building. And so people were consumed by it. Why? Who would do this? How did this happen? And people were fed that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and this enormous feeling of, I'm going to use the word hatred, toward him was palpable in this area.
Say that again. How many days was it from the assassination to him being dead?
Friday and Sunday.
That's a pretty small window. But in those 3 days, were people like, oh my God, we're about to go to World War III?
No.
Okay.
No, people were about, who is this guy? Just like the guy in Maine right now is being gone over with a fine-tooth comb as a result of the mass shooting up there. Who is this guy? What motive? Why did he do what he did? Everybody wants to know those answers. Everybody wanted to know those things about the guy that the officials, law enforcement officials, had paraded out in front of the American people, and that was Lee Harvey Oswald. 24-year-old ex-Marine. Who is this guy? What motivated him? How did he do it? Where was he? What were the circumstances of this guy firing these 3 shots and killing the President of the United States? That was the atmosphere.
Now, literally everyone on the ground at an event like what happened in Lewiston, Maine, not only is a witness, but they're their own broadcasting entity. Every person who was there has a wider audience than even like CBS had in 1963 because
incredibly so,
because of things like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook
and instantly there's no waiting around for the process to run its course.
It'll be difficult to understand for somebody who's not used to that. Everything that you guys were hearing was from a couple of, we say a couple of sources, 2 or 3 sources. Now, they had these vast information gathering armies.
Associated Press, United Press International, those were the print media.
Yeah.
And they fed everybody, the Brattleboro Reformer, the New York Times. You also had 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. So those were the 3.
And for better and for worse, everything you're hearing is getting filtered through them. So in a lot of ways, they're filtering out some of the misinformation and disinformation. Or if there's information that might be relevant, but somebody in a powerful position doesn't want people to hear, they can pluck that out of there pretty easily in a way that can't really be done today, or at least not easily. Mm-hmm. So that's but that's wild. That's counterintuitive to today, this idea that you guys didn't talk about it at all after the assassination.
You'd have to leave the house and be in some kind of a formal setting to be able to do that. You certainly wouldn't walk around the neighborhood to query your neighbors about how they were feeling. That wouldn't have been a thing that any of us would have done anyway. You know, Mike Friel lived a couple of houses up there. I might have spoken with him, but it wasn't the way society operated in those days. You didn't go to Facebook and say, did you see this? You didn't go to Instagram. You didn't go to Twitter.
Did you talk about it in homeroom or social studies class or anything?
No.
Never?
Not that I remember.
Counselors didn't come in?
No. No, none of that apparatus was available.
Okay. So in that environment, it just kind of dies eventually within the public discourse.
It smoldered away.
It
went from a hot fire to smoldering away. Well, I will say one thing, and that is the vast majority of people in this country and the world assumed that Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin before the Warren Commission report came out. Everything pointed to this guy, and all the news reports were about this guy. They weren't speculating about what did the Secret Service do or not do. What did the FBI, state police, county police, city police in Dallas, in Texas, what did they all do? It wasn't about that. It was about this guy. So inadvertently, perhaps at the direction of somebody or somebody's, information was funneled to us that said Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin.
Right. So in that moment, everybody wants Lee, and then once it was over, it was done, and get on the business of living our lives.
Exactly. Yeah, let's move on.
You go on, you do middle school, you do high school, you do college, and then you start teaching. Right? When did you start teaching the assassination, and what was your... Talk about that.
I was teaching United States history to 8th graders at Dummerston Elementary School. I did that for 12 years. And U.S. history in those days was soup to nuts. Wherever you wanted to start, and by that I mean you could go back to Columbus, you could go to 1607, the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown in Virginia. You could go back to 1619 with the arrival of the first African-American slaves. Or you could start at the time of the colonial period leading to the American Revolution. But the point is, from wherever you started, you went to the present. And part of that was the Kennedy assassination. Kennedy was killed in 63, and I was teaching in my first year in 72, 73. So we looked at the Kennedy assassination.
So you're teaching, but then all of a sudden, so I know the story a little bit. So you're teaching at Dummerston, and all of a sudden you see there's something going on at Putney School. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, it wasn't an all of a sudden.
Okay.
I have a very good friend, lifelong friend, Larry Cassidy. At the time, he was the activities director at the Putney School, Elmley Farm, the prestigious private high school in Putney, Vermont. The Putney School ran every year, and they still do, what's called Activities Week. It's the last thing they do in school.
Yeah.
Every student's responsible for presenting a project. It could be something to do with the farm work they did in the barn, or growing crops, or something else.
My friend John went to school there. He recorded a music album.
There you are. There you are. But they also invite somebody in to have a central focus for a few days or a week. But in the late 70s, during their project week, they invited actually a social studies teacher up there by the name of Tony Bocelli, and he had become interested in the Kennedy assassination. And he invited a group out of Cambridge, Massachusetts called the Assassination Information Bureau, the AIB, to come to the school and do a series of presentations. And my friend Larry, knowing of my interest in the Kennedy assassination, said, "You're welcome to come to any or all of the presentations." I went to the first one, and I didn't miss any of them. And I ended up with lots of materials, slides, a copy of the Zapruder film, which I still have.
Pause on that. You wound up with it. That's a... Can you talk about... How rare was that at that point?
That was rare.
Yeah.
That was rare.
What's your 30-second explanation of what the Zapruder film is?
The Zapruder film is a home movie taken by a Dallas citizen who worked in a building in Dealey Plaza, brought his camera.
Abraham Zapruder.
Abraham Zapruder is his name. He brought his camera into the plaza, and he and his secretary, Marilyn Zitzman, found a perch up on the grassy knoll on a pergola that they felt was a good place to film the president for his family, for his grandchildren, just for posterity.
Oh, that's horrible.
Had no idea what was going to happen.
Oh, my God.
And the motorcade comes around the corner, the 135-degree turn around Houston onto Elm Street, and starts toward him, and inadvertently he filmed the assassination of the President of the United States. It is arguably the greatest piece of home video footage in history. One of the people affiliated with and working with the Assassination Information Bureau was a young Robert Groden. And Groden, at one point, was working in New York City and got access to do some work with the Zapruder film. And somehow, between him and his affiliation with the Assassination Information Bureau, copies were made. How many, I don't know, but not that many. And among the things I was given by the Assassination Information Bureau, and de facto Bob Groden, who didn't know me and I didn't know him at all, was a copy of the Zapruder film. 8mm copy. This was absolutely unequivocally the most blockbuster piece of film
It was
historically seen.
Yeah, I mean, if he was going to set up a shot to film that event, that's where he would set it up. Unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So when did you start showing students the Zapruder film?
Probably 1978, 79.
Wow. Okay. So I saw that presentation. I was a high school student in the early mid-90s, and you were my history teacher, United States history. It was known that you had this JFK presentation, and that was just sort of in the ether. That was just something the students knew.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was just like, oh yeah, Holiday, he's got this JFK thing that he does. So that's just the preamble to us walking into the class one day, and there's a projector set up on one of the desks.
An 8mm
An
projector,
8
which you'd
millim.
never seen before.
Nope. Nope. And I don't know what you had on the board, but all of a sudden there's like a little bit of a, I'm going to try not to embellish this. This is a true story. There's a little bit of a rumble in the classroom, and there's like, oh, wow, okay, we're about to get the JFK lecture. And we knew you had the film. And I think we were all kind of like, oh, wow, we're going to see this now. Holy crap. And we saw it. And you gave the whole presentation. I think classes were 45 minutes. And I don't think anybody walked out of that room thinking Lee Harvey Oswald killed JFK. And I know that wasn't your intention to like sway anyone's opinion, but I don't think anyone watching that film could think that that sort of kill shot came from the back. It's just sort of so obvious watching it, but
Doesn't make sense.
it doesn't make any sense at all. But it was shocking, and that was a time when the internet was like, you couldn't see video on the internet at that point, or you could, but it would take you a week to download. It just wasn't available, and so we were not ready for that. I think no one is. Even if I told you, okay, in the next 11 frames, you're going to see the president's head explode, you're not ready for watching that. And so when that happened, that was an altering experience and the kind of thing you don't get in the classroom. So I think that's one of the things that people remember.
No matter who I show the Zapruder film to, I always have prefacing remarks that a man is going to be killed here, and he's not going to appear on another show as another character next month. This is, in actuality, a human being being executed. Bob Groden on the Geraldo Rivera show in March of 1975, Groden's the first one that made the Zapruder film public. He showed the film that I have at my home and that he had worked on when he had an opportunity in the 70s. The people in the audience at the television studio that day were just...
So that's the Zapruder film. So you suddenly have a copy of it.
I do, and I had slides from the autopsy, from Warren Commission exhibits.
You went and you met with that group and you came away with all that material. And,
I did.
And all of a sudden you're teaching that to students.
Well, I was using it in my teaching.
Right. Well, how did the students respond when you started bringing this stuff into the classroom? What happens when you show the students the Zapruder film?
There was an audible sound in the room. They were aghast. Jaws dropped. I was a non-textbook user and always felt the more primary source materials I could put my students in touch with, the more they'd learn and become interested in the topic. For example, if I had 50 students in a class, I could assign them a specific, or they could pick, that's the way I always did it. They could pick a specific aspect of the assassination and do pretty serious research on it and then make a presentation.
Do you want to talk about some of the students who really took the presentation to heart and where they took it from there?
I was aware of the JFK Lancer organization in Dallas, and I was aware that they offered a scholarship to a student and a teacher. I was interested in the student scholarship because I could then ask students, if you'd like to pursue this a little more than a day or a few days, classes, come and see me. Stop by and see me, and I'll give you some options. And Marco Pinella came to me and said, I'd be interested in doing some research on
one of your students. He was
one of my students.
A junior or something in U.S. history. Or
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the same class you took, Red.
Yeah.
And so he did research, and we submitted it. And he was chosen as the outstanding student in the country for his research into the Kennedy assassination. I went with him to Dallas so he could receive his award. And a consequence of that was he had to give a presentation. I didn't know that. He didn't know that. I said, it's okay, just, you don't really need to prepare anything too much, maybe a little outline so you don't forget what you want to say, but just speak from the heart.
Other students did that too, right?
Others did it too for the next several years. And another one by the name of Michelle Alec, whose father was a local police officer here in Brattleboro. She won the National Student of the Year. Another one, Elizabeth, a.k.a. Giz Tolino, finished runner-up. So within the space of 4 years, 2 Brattleboro Union High School students won the National Student of the Year award for their research into the Kennedy assassination. One finished second.
And you thought Giz could have won, but...
Absolutely and unequivocally. When we got down there and saw the presentation of the student who was given the award, it was very clear that Giz was...
it was good.
Giz was good. And she was better than anybody that was down there.
Yeah. In 1999, what was what happened then? What was your...
Well, you mean as far as...
Your stuff?
Myself, yeah. Well, having run a string of students through that kind of experience, Lancer recognized me as its National Teacher of the Year award winner. And I was honored. That was 1999. I went to Dallas, and every year at the exact time, and leading up to it, about a half hour before and then a little bit after, but at the exact time, 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, there is a moment of silence and a remembrance of the assassination of President Kennedy, where it happened. And the assembled congregate on the grassy knoll, probably 15 feet away from where Abraham Zapruder was on the day of the assassination. A microphone sound system is set up, and presentations are given. And I was required to give a presentation. I said to myself, oh, damn, I've got to make a presentation. And I actually, for one of the rare times in my public speaking career, if you will, I actually put down some notes on legal pad, and it was very windy that day, so I had a difficult time holding on to them. But I made a short, which is always important, but I thought important enough contribution to that event.
You took Marco down to give that presentation, but eventually, or at some point, you started taking groups of students down to Dallas.
When I felt comfortable enough, and I had begun to know these witnesses that you and I have talked about to various aspects of the Kennedy assassination, I became pretty friendly with some of them. Bob Groden, for example, had become a friend. Yeah. So he would meet with the students. We took him to dinner. Beverly Oliver was always willing to speak with the students.
Did you start taking groups of students down after Marco?
Yes.
Okay.
Not because of Marco necessarily, but after. I felt comfortable enough. I can bring students here if they want to come here.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that brainstorm where all of a sudden, because that's what I always like thinking about, is that moment of inspiration for you. That's what I want to hear about. That moment of inspiration for you where you were like, you know what? Why don't I take a group of students down and we'll take them around and we'll go to the hotel and we'll eat cookies and go to the 6th floor museum and walk around the plaza. Because we're also talking about potentially inspiring other teachers to do this sort of thing. So when did that crystallize in your head that this is something I could do with students?
I can't answer that because I don't know that it happened that way. It's like many other things that happen to me, they develop. Yeah. I'm not struck by lightning, which is what you're looking for, lightning in a bottle, and then all of a sudden something happens. But with most of my courses, I would say to students, during the course of this course, we will be learning these things. If you're interested in any of these specific things when we get to them, let me know, and I'll be happy to take those of you who'd like to go. If you want to go to Dallas to see where the Kennedy assassination took place, we can go, and I can show you all those places. I can also introduce you to some eyewitnesses. We'll sit with them. We'll talk with them. We took Bob Groden to dinner one night. He was thrilled to go to dinner with a student. You were part of that trip.
I did one of those trips, and Bob Croden, I was like, he's Mick Jagger at that table with those students. And it was this big table, like the Last Supper in this steakhouse. And Groden's there, like
Sonny's Steakhouse.
Sonny's
In the
Steakhouse.
West End of Dallas.
I should have worn the T-shirt. I've got it in the other room. I should have worn it. I'll go put it on in our next pee break. We'll be here for another 6 hours. We're sitting there at this. I love that. So, but that's whole part of the experience of this thing is like we're all in this steakhouse and we're just talking it, and he's swarmed, and they have all these really insightful, really great questions for Bob Groden, who knows everything there is to know about the assassination, and these students who are like juniors and seniors in high school, like 16, 17, 18-year-old kids, are just peppering him with these really, really good questions that he's able to get expansive on and riff, and they are just riveted.
To me, that's an incredible experience to sit side by side with somebody who'd been through what Bob Groden. Bob Groden was, his 18th birthday was the day of the assassination. Wow. That's what hooked him. That is a defining moment for him. I don't have one, but that's one for him. But yes, and he was very accommodating, very generous.
Well, he was being treated like a rock star. It was really outstanding to see, because it was like everybody was sort of in their element there.
People have always said about my groups how knowledgeable they are. I don't take people to a place for, I'm being flippant here, but a field trip. No, we're going down there to supplement in the most powerful way imaginable your personal experience with this event.
I think when I went, we met with Beverly Oliver. We met James Tigg, Jim Lavelle.
And Bob Groden.
Groden,
not a witness, but a major researcher. The other three witnesses.
And well, Jim Lavelle was famously handcuffed to Lee Harvey Oswald when...
That's a pretty good witness.
Yep.
When handcuffed to Lee Harvey Oswald at the moment that Lee Harvey Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby in the basement of the Dallas City Jail.
You've been going to Dallas for a long time. You've been talking to these people, and you've been interviewing them, and you've been recording those interviews. And for your students to use, all of a sudden, you're teaching, then you're not teaching, you're retired. You have all this material. And then I'm going to ask you for the thing that probably didn't happen, the aha moment we were thinking, oh, okay, well, actually, I'll compile this all, or not all of it. But
there's a semi-aha moment with this one. But people, I won't say bugging, people have been encouraging me for many years. You know, when are you going to write your book on the Kennedy assassination? You seem to know so much. And I don't know. Like many people who really know the intricacies of the Kennedy assassination. And in most cases, that knowledge is compartmentalized.
Yeah.
Researchers who've worked on this and others who've worked on that, and Bob Groden with his film and photographic evidence, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there are many, many far more knowledgeable people about the Kennedy assassination than I am. And I would tell people who were advocating for me to write a book that that was the case, and they wouldn't believe it because their only access really to the Kennedy assassination was through my stuff. But I said, why not? And so I started to put it together. I had these audio files and in some cases video files, and every time I talked with anybody, you know, is it okay to use this for, and no one ever denied me. Well, actually, I was denied in a couple of cases in my career, and I've not used those. No, you may not use this. One was connected with the troubles in Northern Ireland, for example. It's not about the Kennedy assassination. But I started to put things together, and I said, I wonder which pieces of this people would be most interested in. And I wanted to take a tact that no one else had taken. What they told me. I'm not trying to solve the case. I'm not trying to nitpick on the magic bullet. Arlen Specter invented the magic bullet theory. That one bullet, bear with me, could hit the president 6 inches down from his collar, from above and behind, on a downward trajectory. and somehow, once it hit the president's back, move upward, exit his throat, continue forward in the same car, and hit the governor of Texas, shattering 2 ribs in his back, collapsing his right lung, injuring his right wrist. We're all in the same bullet now, and causing a superficial wound on his left thigh. That one bullet could do that. Arlen Specter, 32-year-old staffer for the Warren Commission, working out of the district attorney's office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, gave a talk on the 40th anniversary at Duquesne University. And I watched him come up the stairs with an entourage, and there were, 4,000 people there, most of them non-believers in the Warren Commission report. And he finished his remarks, and I said, you know what? I shut down my equipment. I was recording him. I said, he came in that way. There's a chance he'll come off this side of the stage. And I perched myself at the bottom of the steps, and he came off that side, walked down the 3 or 4 steps, and he was right there face to face, slightly taller than I am. Mm. And I asked him about the magic bullet. And this is a quote. That bullet had to go somewhere. And until somebody proves differently, I will stand by my story. Arlen Specter.
He was a big deal senator at that
United States. He went on to become a United States senator and ultimately switched from the Republican to the Democratic Party at the very end of his senatorial career in Pennsylvania. Very highly respected.
Yeah.
And I wasn't doing those saying, oh, someday I'm going to write a book and this stuff will go. That never, absolutely never crossed my mind. What I was doing was saying to the next batch of kids that might be interested in the Kennedy assassination, I have these things. Yeah. So you can do work with Jim Tague. You can do work with Jim Lavelle. You can do work with Linda Willis, etc. Here are these audio and or video files. Now put together some kind of a presentation. I was always interested in that, not in the paper. If you write a paper, you see it and I see it.
Right.
I always wanted to benefit all of the students by the work of the students. So some kind of a presentation. You can make it a digital.
Say that again, will you? Because I love that.
What's that?
If I write a paper for you, you and I are the only people that see it.
We are the only people that see it.
But if I create a presentation and give it to the class, the entire class benefits from my research.
Not only that, but research used to say, it's probably changed, but back in my day, research used to say, you want somebody to learn something, have them teach it. If you want people not to remember anything, just tell them. I tell you something, the average learner retains about 15%. You are put in a position of teaching me something, then you have to learn it in order to teach it. And your success rate goes up into the 90th percentile. Not only that, but the other students benefit from it. And you can generate some enthusiasm and pride for what you're doing because you're not just doing it for me. I never wanted students to, I would tell students, don't do this for me. It's not what I want. What do you want out of it? And that frustrated some students. I had students, I had parents come to me and say, will you just tell my daughter what she needs to do for an A? And I would say, well, wait a minute. What's your daughter capable of? How's she ever going to find out what she can do? If I'm putting an arbitrary limit on her, what if my limit for an A is C+ for her?
Right.
And she gets an A with a C+ effort? That's not right for her. Give her a chance to see what she can do. You got me fired up, Jay. Here.
Well, when did you start the book in earnest?
Well, to put the book together, I said, I wonder what parts of this, my experience, could be most interesting to people. And those are the people I put in the book. I wanted to pick out the people that I thought might most interest readers. I think I've done that. I hope I've done that.
Talk about that process. How do you even? Because it worked. Here's what I'll say quickly. Now I'll digress a little bit.
Thank you.
Here's what I would say about the book. Don't start with that book. Don't come in cold. Like, that's not the first book you want to read about the assassination. But if you know even a little bit, or you don't have to read a whole book about the assassination, but if you know a little bit about it, it does grab you immediately because there are just really interesting questions, critical thinking stuff happening, like, just immediately. And you're like, wow. It's challenging in a very accessible way immediately, in a way that's engaging for the reader. Like,
You know what, G? I'm happy that happened, especially to a guy of your cerebral nature, because it wasn't necessarily intended that way, but I'm glad that somebody could see it that way.
it's like, well, one of the earliest chapters is the ambulance driver. And it's sort of like, well, who cares about the ambulance driver? Well, this is a guy who is immediately in the aftermath was in the room with Jacqueline Kennedy. And all of a sudden you're hearing stories of her like bumming a cigarette from him. And him going to grab the cigarette and just getting jumped by the Secret Service.
Who thought he was reaching for a gun.
For a gun.
Hmm.
And
That's a human interest story.
Yeah.
That's a regular guy.
yeah,
That's a 24-year-old guy who's got a job working for the O'Neill Funeral Service.
$1 contract. That's the
With the
kind of
city.
detail that's in the book.
That's right, with the city.
Yeah.
That Aubrey Wright gave me that information. Al Wright, the guy you're talking about. But at that time in Dallas and maybe other cities too, they would serve as hearses for funerals.
Right.
So they were ambulances. The same vehicle, could serve the other purpose. He was in Dealey Plaza 10 minutes before the shooting, 20 after 12.
Guy with a seizure.
A man had a seizure, or alleged to have had a seizure, and the medics were called, and Al Reich was there, and they attended to that. And Reich, in hindsight, thinks that, and had the motorcade been on time, it would have stopped Kennedy's car, flattened its tracks right on Houston Street, making him available for, pardon the terminology here, but a turkey shoot.
Even more accessible than he already was.
Exactly. So he was there, and then he was called to the hospital to take President Kennedy's body to the airport where it could be put on Air Force One.
But the details that grab me is the stuff like him with the cigarette, and then there's Secret Service agents, and I think they're sort of in shock at that point, and they're kind of yucking it up, and he laughs too, and they tell him to shut his goddamn mouth.
Or
Like,
they'll
what are
shut
you
it
What are you
for him.
laughing at? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's sort of those kind of details that really grabbed me.
Yeah. I don't know if I put in about Mrs. Kennedy, but when they were readying to take the president's body and put it in the O'Neill vehicle, Al Reich was there. He was the driver.
Yeah.
And the Secret Service insisted on driving, and Al Reich wasn't going to go in. The vehicle was going to be commandeered by the Secret Service, and Al Reich wasn't going to drive it. And Mrs. Kennedy turned to them and him and said, "No, he's going. He's the only gentleman I've met since I've been here in Dallas." I don't know if that's in there.
I don't recall reading that. I do.
Okay, I left it out.
Yeah, that is interesting. But
And so he rode out.
yeah, with her, yeah. He said she was difficult to talk to at the time. Or no. It was not so much that she was. He was very tongue tied around her. It sounded like she tried to.
Well, think of the aura of
my
the
God.
Kennedys and her aura.
And what
bigger
had just
than his.
And what had just happened.
Bigger than his in many cases. He's in trauma room 1. His head is blasted apart. His wife is in there. She's covered with blood and brain matter.
In her pink outfit, which he mentions.
Correct.
Very famous. Yeah.
Correct. And imagine the trauma that she felt, as well as other people, but her particularly.
And he's in the room with her at that time.
He's in the room. It's time for him to get in there, and he and his pal, co-worker, Peanuts, Dennis O'Neill,
Yeah.
to take the body out. And Al describes it in detail, how they picked the body up. And Al happened to be on the head end of the body. And when they started to pick it up, Al's hand disappeared into the cadaverous hole in the occipital parietal area in the back right of Kennedy's head. And he says to Peanuts, put him down, put him down. His head's still draining. So they had to get the body ready to go into the casket and take it out. And Mrs. Kennedy takes her wedding ring off.
God, yes.
And attempts to put it on her husband's finger. His finger's too big. And so she decides on the pinky finger as the only one that might accommodate that wedding ring. And Al Reich gets her, at her request, some KY jelly, Vaseline, whatever, puts it on the finger, and she slips that ring on there. I assume it's still with him in Arlington National Cemetery. Her wedding ring.
It also got my mind going, this idea of the first thing you hear about Kennedy is like, oh, conspiracies, and there's all of these behaviors happening after the fact that reek of cover-up and conspiracy and all those sorts of things. And as I was listening to that, just between the lines, you see the Secret Service agents kind of freaking out like they've screwed up, basically. Like the worst thing has happened. And this is just my own thinking. Like, again, this is just the kind of thought that was put in motion by this book, whereas, oh man, it's not so much that they're covering up a conspiracy, they're more like covering up their own ass, is what a lot of that kind of sounded like to me. And that's just a thought I had at the time. I think it was those human details take you to a different place that I think helps bring history alive to people in a different way than a sort of a strictly narrative kind of textbook would be, where this is really sort of an oral history. It's a combination of you're telling the story, but it's also an oral history, and that's just it can bring a story that, as we've been talking about this story, one of the things that I've been seeking to do is try to bring it to make it real for myself, just as I'm listening to it. It's just something I try to do to help me better understand it, and I think that this book has done that in a lot of ways, just by bringing up the little details that kind of remind a person that this actually really happened. This is a real thing that happened,
and it happened to real people,
it was
ordinary people.
Yeah,
I always tried to impress that on my students when they say, "I'm going to do what? You want me to call who?
Yeah,
what? What? Look, that guy got out of bed today just like you did. And he went through the same process you did. Cleaned himself up, dressed himself, had some breakfast, got in his car and went to work. Just like you did. Work being your school. He's no different than you. Don't be intimidated by that. You'll never know if you don't approach somebody."
Did you call Marina Oswald? Did that happen?
I telephoned Marina Oswald and talked to her for 10 to 12 minutes on the telephone. At the time, she had remarried Marina Oswald Porter.
She remarried pretty quick.
I don't know how quickly.
I think it was 65.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what was the nature of that discussion?
Well, the things that struck me about Marina Oswald were she was very polite.
Mm-hmm.
Her diction was impeccable.
As good as yours?
Stop it. Yes, better. Her diction was impeccable. And her English was very good.
Oh, she got better.
Very good, but with a discernible Russian accent. You know, we say Russian. She lived in the Soviet Union, not in Russia.
Where was she from? She was from...
Belarus, I
right.
think. Yeah. In the city of Minsk.
Yeah.
The city of Minsk. That's where she met Oswald. And they fell in love and came back to the United States.
And she wouldn't talk about him.
Oh, yes. That's the other thing. The fourth thing. She would talk to me about other things, peripheral things, but was very adamant and firm. I will not talk about my former husband, Lee Harvey Oswald. And I talked to her for a while and then tried to approach it again. Maybe she's more comfortable with me now, but she reiterated what she'd said earlier. She didn't apologize for it. Her voice wasn't apologetic.
Sure.
But she was firm, and polite. I told her I wouldn't bother her again. She didn't have to worry.
Did you get a sense of whether she was bothered by people? I mean, how often?
Yeah, she was bothered by people. And put yourself in her position.
Can't imagine.
Her husband's gone, perhaps committed the murder of the century, or in United States history. He's been murdered in a murder of the century. And she's this Russian girl, this Soviet girl, who's been in the United States for not very long and could be deported.
Yeah.
So
right.
when the authorities come to her, the consensus is today that it depended on who she was talking to, what answer she gave. At times, implicating Lee Oswald, at other times, exonerating him. So she goes down as an unreliable witness.
I'd ask about her. I mean, she's fascinating, but we don't know that much about her.
Do you know one time when I went to Dallas, she was still working in a Neiman Marcus.
What did she do?
A sales clerk.
Wow. Huh. She was gorgeous, worth noting.
She's a very good-looking woman.
Yeah.
Yeah. She was always paranoid about her teeth.
Right. Dennis David. Who was Dennis David?
Dennis David was at Bethesda Naval Hospital when President Kennedy's body arrived.
Okay. You talked to him in 1998.
I interviewed him with students once and individually, just the two of us, and I took several photographs of him. I'm not sure of this. I'd have to confirm it, but I was at least one of the last people, maybe the last people, to do an interview with Dennis David in Dallas about his experience. And what comes out of his experience is his wife's fear and pressure on him not to say anything. Witnesses who have talked about their experiences are getting killed. Beverly Oliver was threatened, got a note of cutout letters sent to her home. Snitch, you're dead if you talk about this. And Beverly kind of threw her hands up and said, you know what? The truth needs to be told. If somebody out there still at this point wants to kill me, I guess they're going to do it. But she also feels that it's beyond that at this particular point. But when she first spoke to my students, there was some nervousness in her life.
In the 90s.
In the 1990s, 30 years after the assassination. 40 years after the assassination. And the same with him. He asked his wife, you know, I have information that might help solve this case. She said, no. Don't go to the authorities. Don't say anything. But he started to speak out eventually. Again, almost 40 years after the assassination.
I'm going to put you on the spot. I think you can do this, at least partially. These were not idle threats. Can you briefly just go through some of the people that met untimely demises that were associated with this case, including, I mean, we talked about, like you talked about, who was it, Ferry, and even the guy who Garrison sued or tried, and I mean, it was just like all these people was just...
Judith Very Baker, who's alive today, has said that, well, she lives somewhat incognito because her life is still being threatened today for the story that she's come through with. On the top of the grassy knoll, behind the shrubbery, is a parking lot, used to be for employees of the school book depository. Out there is a building, which is the train switching yard. That used to be done manually. There was a guy whose job was to be in that building and move the trains through the train yard around the school book depository. His name is Lee Bowers, was Lee Bowers. He died of very suspicious means right before he might have, and did to a certain degree, corroborate what another witness saw happen up there in that parking lot. That other witness is Ed Hoffman, the deaf fellow. People died of karate chops to the neck. People died when they were allegedly ran away from the police and were shot in the back. There's suspicion in that case that the police turned this guy loose and told him to get out of here. That's all speculation.
Mm-hmm.
And then shot him in the back saying he was trying to escape.
People died handcuffed to police officers.
Yeah, well, that's documented. That's on film. Lee Harvey Oswald, the key witness. And without Lee Harvey Oswald, there's no trial because the investigation was stopped at that point. It never went any further.
Ruby, how did Ruby died, what of cancer, but was it?
1967, Jack Ruby was in prison, ironically in the Dallas County Jail, which overlooks Dealey Plaza. He died of cancer, correct, and had always protested that he would be happy to testify and tell the truth if you'll take me to Washington. I'm not going to testify here in front of these people, he said. And they, quote, officials claimed that they couldn't take him to Washington because he might be killed in the transfer like Oswald had been killed in the transfer. So you're staying right here. You're going to have to tell what you know here.
David Ferry, was that? Who was the pilot?
David Ferry was involved in that. He was a pilot among many, many other things. Very complicated character. I never talked to David Ferry, so he's not a subject in the book.
But he had a weird suicide, maybe.
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah. Well, we're total speculation.
Right,
now.
right.
Yeah.
But the point is these people all were associated, all had things to say, all died untimely, strange deaths within a pretty short period after the assassination.
Sylvia Maher's book, Accessories After the Fact, lists them as they were known in 1964.
Wow. When
she wrote the book, and it's half a page long. I should have put that in there. I didn't put it in. This book could be 1,000 pages if I put everything.
Right.
And all the people I've talked to. But I said, this is probably long enough. People don't like to pick up a phone book.
No, it's a good length. Do you have any fear for your personal safety? No, I wouldn't think so. You and I are not historians, but we have a certain amount of training in history. We were history people. And I think one of the things we learn about in dealing with primary sources is we don't really worry about whether people are, if we're talking to someone, a witness or whatever, we take into account the fact that they're maybe not getting it right, or the eyewitness testimony is fallible, or people might be lying to us. And all of those things are factored in the sense that they're important for various reasons, including what people choose to lie about. This is just sort of instructive for people who might be reading primary sources for the first time. This is an example that I got when I was in school. FDR sent out all these people to interview. It was a works project thing where they sent out people to interview former slaves, because this is the era where slaves were starting to die, where people who lived during pre-Civil War and post-Civil War, and they're like, we want to get experience of what those experiences was like. Well, they got very different interviews based on who the interviewers were, or if they're talking to young white college students, these older black folks would give a different story. They would say, oh, it wasn't so bad. We were sort of treated okay. They cared for us. They housed us. We worked hard. It sucked. It was slavery, but it wasn't so bad. Well, then if they talk to a young black person, they'd say, no, this is oppressive. We were treated like animals, and they sort of got different stories depending on who they were talking to. And that's a totally understandable thing. And so as somebody's reading this book, understand that they're talking to you. Everything that people read in this book is something that somebody is saying to you.
And they all had a genuine interest in creating enough interest in the students so that the students could continue forward and find the truth. Find the truth. My generation hasn't found the truth. Pursue the truth. The pursuit is what's worth it. Not necessarily what you find or don't find at the end of the rainbow, but it's the pursuit that defines you in life as well as a project like this or any other project.